The night my farm burned down, my son didn't ask if I was okay. He asked where I was going to live. I stood at the edge of what used to be my front porch, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching thin gray smoke drift into the morning sky, as if it were trying to take the last 40 years of my life with it. The smell of charred wood still clinging to the air like something that refused to leave, and I remember thinking how strange it was that silence could feel louder than any storm I had ever lived through, because there were no tractors humming, no chickens clucking, no wind pushing through the cornfields that no longer stood, just this hollow, empty quiet that settled deep into my bones, the kind that makes you realize something final has happened, something you can't undo no matter how hard you try. And at 68 years old, I had just lost the only place I had ever truly called mine. The farmhouse my husband and I built together back when we still believed hard work could protect us from anything. Back when Daniel used to run barefoot through the fields, laughing, before he grew up and learned how to look at me like I was a problem that needed solving, not a mother who had given him everything. And when he pulled up that morning with Ashley in the passenger seat, both of them stepping out in clothes too clean for a place that had just lost everything, I already knew from the way she crossed her arms and from the way he wouldn't meet my eyes that whatever came next wasn't going to sound like comfort. And I was right. Because he didn't hug me, didn't even touch my shoulder, he just cleared his throat and said, "Mom, you can't stay here." Like I had been planning to, like I didn't already know there was nothing left to stay for. And then Ashley added, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut, "It's not safe. And honestly, you don't have anywhere to go, so you should start figuring that out." And there it was, not concern, not grief, just a quiet dismissal wrapped in polite words, the kind that makes you feel smaller than you thought possible. And I nodded because I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to give them that, even as the weight of it pressed down on my chest, even as I realized that losing my home hadn't been the worst part of that morning. Being unwanted had. And as they drove away, leaving dust swirling behind their tires, I stood there alone with nothing but the clothes I had grabbed in a hurry and the memory of a life that no longer existed. And for the first time in decades, I didn't know where I was going next, but I did know one thing. I wasn't going to ask them for help. Not now, not ever. I checked into the cheapest motel I could find just off Route 16, the kind of place where the neon sign flickers even in the middle of the day and the carpet smells faintly of something you cannot quite place. And I remember standing in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, as if crossing that threshold meant admitting something I was not ready to say out loud, that I no longer had a home. Not in the way I used to understand it. Not in the way that meant something solid and permanent. And I set my small bag down on the bed, the springs creaking under the weight as if even they were tired. And I sat there for a while, hands folded in my lap, staring at the faded wallpaper, trying to understand how a life that had taken decades to build could be reduced to a single overnight bag and a receipt printed on thin paper. And the quiet followed me there too. But it was different from the quiet of the farm. This one felt temporary, borrowed, like I did not belong to it, and it did not belong to me. And I found myself reaching for my phone more than once, not because I expected it to ring, but because some part of me still believed that maybe Daniel would call, maybe he would realize what he had said, what he had done, maybe he would remember who I was before everything became inconvenient for him. But the screen stayed dark, and after a while I stopped checking, because hope can be a heavy thing when it has nowhere to land. And later that evening I walked to a small diner across the road, ordered a cup of coffee and a slice of pie I did not really want, and listened to the conversations around me, strangers talking about weather, about work, about ordinary things that suddenly felt distant from my own life, as if I had stepped out of it without meaning to. And when the waitress asked if I was passing through, I nodded without thinking, because it was easier than explaining that I had nowhere to pass through to. And when I returned to the room, I sat by the window and watched cars move along the highway, headlights stretching into thin lines before disappearing into the dark. And I thought about the farm again, about the way the sun used to rise over the fields, about the sound of the wind moving through the crops, about the life I had built with my own hands. And I realized something slowly, quietly, without anger, that losing the farm had taken away my past. But what my son had said that morning had tried to take away my place in the present. And that was something I could not allow, because I had spent too many years being the one who held everything together to now accept being treated like something that could simply be set aside. And as I sat there in that small motel room, with nothing but the hum of the air conditioner and the faint glow of the streetlight outside, I began to understand that this was not the end of my story. It was just the first moment I had been forced to see it clearly, and clarity, even when it arrives quietly, has a way of changing everything. The next morning I woke up before the sun, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my body had not yet learned that there was no farm waiting for me, no chores that needed doing before the heat settled over the fields. And for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioner, trying to remember what day it was, what came next, and then it all returned quietly, not like a shock, but like a fact that had already made its place inside me, and I sat up slowly, my joints stiff in a way that felt heavier than usual, as if even they understood that something fundamental had shifted, and I made myself a cup of coffee using the small machine on the counter, watching the thin stream fill the paper cup, thinking about how different it was from the strong pot I used to brew every morning in my own kitchen, where everything had a place and every corner carried a memory, and I took a sip and set it down, because it did not taste like anything I recognized. And as I stood there by the window, looking out at the empty parking lot, I realized how quickly a person can become invisible when they are no longer anchored to a place. How easily the world continues without asking where you have gone. And later that morning I drove back toward what used to be my land. Not because I expected to find anything new, but because there are some things you need to see more than once before they feel real. And when I arrived, there were already people there, not neighbors, not anyone I knew, but men in clean shirts and pressed pants, walking the property with clipboards in their hands, measuring, pointing, talking in low voices as if they were discussing something ordinary, something routine, and I stayed in my car for a moment, watching them through the windshield, a quiet unease settling in my chest, because something about the way they moved did not match the kind of loss that had happened there. And when I stepped out and approached, one of them turned to me with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes and asked if he could help me. And I told him this was my property, or at least it had been, and his expression shifted just slightly, not to surprise, but to recognition, like he had expected me to show up eventually. And he said they were there on behalf of an insurance company, that they were assessing the land for valuation, and I nodded slowly, even though his words did not sit right with me, because I had not filed any claim, had not spoken to any agent, had not signed anything that would bring strangers onto my land so quickly. And as I stood there listening to him explain details that felt too prepared, too immediate, I felt something inside me sharpen, not anger, not yet, but awareness. The kind that makes you pay attention to things you might have overlooked before. And I thanked him and walked back to my car without asking more questions, because sometimes it is better to listen first, to let people believe you understand less than you do. And as I drove away, the image of those men stayed with me, their calm, their certainty, the way they had arrived so quickly after everything had been lost, and for the first time since that night, I began to wonder not just what I had lost, but who might have already been prepared for it to happen. That afternoon I sat on the edge of the motel bed with my purse open beside me, going through papers I had not looked at in years, old receipts, folded documents, a few photographs I had carried out without thinking. And it was strange how something as simple as sorting through a handful of papers could feel like retracing an entire life, because each piece carried a memory I had not planned to revisit, and I found myself slowing down, not because I had nowhere else to be, but because something in me was trying to connect what I had seen that morning with everything that had come before. And as I turned over a faded envelope, I noticed a number written on the back in blue ink, the handwriting not mine, but familiar in a way that made me pause. And for a moment I could not place it, until the memory surfaced quietly, like something that had been waiting for the right time to be remembered, and I saw him again. A small boy with neatly combed hair and oversized glasses, sitting at my kitchen table all those years ago, swinging his legs while I set a plate of sandwiches in front of him, asking endless questions about everything, about the farm, about the weather, about why things worked the way they did, and I remembered how serious he had been even then, how he would listen carefully, as if every answer mattered, and how he had once told me that when he grew up, he wanted to build something big, something important, not for the money, but because he liked the idea of creating things that lasted, and I had laughed at the time, not because I did not believe him, but because children say many things that fade as they grow older. Yet something about him had felt different, steady, focused in a way that stayed with me long after his family moved away, and I realized then that the number in my hand belonged to him. Ethan Brooks, the boy I had watched over on quiet afternoons while his parents worked in the city. The boy who had once insisted on helping me fix a broken fence, even though he barely knew how to hold a hammer, and I could still hear his voice, clear and certain, saying that people should take care of those who took care of them. And I sat there holding that small piece of paper, feeling the weight of the years between then and now, wondering what kind of man he had become, whether he had remembered any of those afternoons, whether any of it had meant as much to him as it had to me. And I did not reach for the phone right away, because some decisions require more than impulse. They require a quiet kind of honesty, the kind that asks you to admit where you are and what you need. And I had spent most of my life being the one others relied on, the one who solved problems without asking for anything in return. And now, sitting in that small room with the distant sound of traffic moving past outside, I realized that asking for help was not the same as giving up. It was simply choosing not to stand alone when you did not have to. And I placed the paper carefully on the nightstand beside the bed, not as a last resort, but as a possibility, one that I was beginning to understand might matter more than I had ever expected. I did not call him that night, even though the number sat just inches away from my hand, because there is a difference between remembering someone and stepping back into their life, and I needed to be certain I was doing the second for the right reasons, not out of fear or desperation, but out of clarity. And so I waited until the next morning, when the light coming through the thin curtains felt a little steadier, a little less uncertain, and I made myself another cup of coffee, sat down at the small table by the window, and picked up the phone with both hands, holding it for a moment as if it might weigh more than it did, and then I dialed the number slowly, each digit pressing me forward in a way I could not take back. And when the line began to ring, I almost hung up, not because I had changed my mind, but because hearing it connect made everything real in a way thinking about it never could. And then a voice answered, calm, professional, not his, but someone who spoke his name with a kind of familiarity. That told me I had not been wrong, that he had become exactly the kind of man he once said he would be, and I introduced myself simply, Margaret Collins, not expecting recognition, not expecting anything at all beyond a polite response. And there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you wonder if you should say more, and then the tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I could hear it, and the person asked me to hold for a moment, and I sat there listening to the faint hum of the line, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the quiet of the room settle around me again. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt like something waiting, and then I heard his voice, older now, steadier, but unmistakably his, and he said my name in a way that made it clear he had not forgotten, not even after all these years. And for a moment I did not answer, because there are some things you do not prepare for, no matter how many times you imagine them. And when I finally spoke, I kept my words simple, telling him who I was, where I was, not asking for anything, just stating the facts as they stood, because I had learned that how you present your situation matters just as much as the situation itself. And there was no pity in his response, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty as he asked me a few questions about the farm, about what had happened, about whether I was safe, and I answered each one calmly, leaving out nothing but also adding nothing that did not need to be said. And when I finished, there was another pause, shorter this time, followed by a single sentence that changed the direction of everything without raising his voice or making a promise he could not keep. He told me he would take care of it, not in a way that sounded like a favor, but in a way that sounded like a decision already made. And before I could respond, he asked where I was staying, wrote it down, and told me to expect someone to reach out within the hour. And then the call ended as simply as it had begun, leaving me sitting there with the phone still in my hand, realizing that something had shifted, not because I had been rescued, but because I had chosen not to remain where I had been placed, and that choice, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything I had lost. The call ended, and for a few minutes I did not move, not because I did not know what to do next, but because I understood that whatever came next would not look like anything I had known before, and I placed the phone gently on the table, aligning it with the edge as if that small act of order might steady the shift I felt inside. And then I waited, not anxiously, not pacing or checking the time, just sitting there with my hands folded, listening to the low hum of the room, the kind of waiting that comes when you have already made a decision and the rest is no longer in your control. And exactly 40 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, soft, precise, not hurried. And when I opened it, a woman stood there in a tailored navy coat, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that felt practiced, and she introduced herself as Rebecca Hayes, speaking my name with the same quiet certainty I had heard in his voice, and she stepped inside only after I nodded, taking in the room with a quick glance that missed nothing, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that suggested she was already measuring what needed to change, and she did not waste time with unnecessary questions. Instead, she set a slim folder on the table, opened it, and began explaining the next steps as if they had been prepared long before I had made that call. And I listened carefully, not interrupting, noting the way she spoke in clear, simple terms, no confusion, no hesitation, outlining arrangements for a temporary place to stay, transportation, access to legal consultation. Each detail presented not as an offer, but as something already in motion, and I realized then that this was not about charity. It was about structure, about systems that move quietly but effectively when set into place. And when she asked if I had any immediate needs, I shook my head, because for the first time since everything had happened, I did not feel like I was standing on uncertain ground, and she nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something. And then she handed me a card with her direct number, explaining that she would be my point of contact moving forward, her voice steady, professional, but not distant. And before leaving, she paused at the door and said something that stayed with me long after she was gone. She said that Mr. Brooks does not forget the people who shaped him, and the way she said it made it clear that this was not a temporary arrangement, not something that would fade once the immediate problem was handled. And after she left, I stood in the middle of that small room, looking at the folder now resting on the table, at the card in my hand, and I understood that what had begun as a simple call had opened something much larger, something that extended beyond the loss of my farm, beyond the words my son had used, into a space where things were no longer being decided without me. And I sat down slowly, opening the folder again, reading each page carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just absorbing the fact that for the first time since that morning, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was stepping into what would be done next. The next 2 days moved with a kind of quiet precision that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, as if invisible pieces were being shifted into place around me without noise or confusion, and I followed each step carefully, not questioning, not resisting, simply observing how everything unfolded with a level of order I had not experienced in a long time. And by the afternoon of the second day, Rebecca returned, this time with a different set of documents, her movements just as composed, her tone just as steady. But there was something more beneath it now, something that suggested we were no longer dealing only with immediate arrangements. And she sat across from me, placing the folder between us, and explained that preliminary findings had already begun to surface regarding the situation with my property. And I listened without interrupting, my hands resting calmly in my lap, even as I felt that same quiet awareness sharpen again. The same feeling I had when I saw those men on the land too soon, too prepared. And she told me that the insurance policy connected to the farm had been updated recently, not by me, but through a request filed under my name, and that the timeline of that update did not align with anything I had done or authorized. And I did not react immediately, not outwardly, because there are moments when silence gives you more than questions ever could. And she continued, explaining that access logs, signatures, and communication records were already being reviewed by legal teams, not to accuse, not yet, but to understand. And I nodded slowly, because understanding comes before anything else. And as she spoke, I found myself thinking not about the loss, but about the pattern, the small details that had not made sense before, the way Daniel had avoided my eyes, the way Ashley had spoken with a certainty that did not match the situation, the way strangers had arrived at the property before I had even processed what had happened, and piece by piece, those moments began to align in a way that was difficult to ignore. And when Rebecca finished, She closed the folder gently and looked at me, not with pity, not with urgency, but with a kind of respect that acknowledged I would decide what to do with what I now knew. And I asked only one question, not about the legal process, not about outcomes, but about time. How long it would take to see the full picture clearly, and she answered, without hesitation, explaining that clarity does not come all at once, but it does come, and that every step from here would be handled carefully, thoroughly, without assumption, and I appreciated that more than anything else, because I had spent too many years watching things happen around me without explanation, without being asked. And now, for the first time, I was being given the space to see everything as it truly was. And after she left, I sat alone again. But it did not feel the same as before, because this time the silence carried information, not emptiness. And I understood that whatever had begun on that land had not been an accident of timing or circumstance. It had been part of something planned, something deliberate. And I did not feel anger rise in me. Not yet. Only a steady resolve. Because once you begin to see clearly, you do not rush forward. You move carefully. You watch. You listen. And you wait for the moment when the truth is no longer something you suspect, but something you can stand on without doubt. 2 days later, Rebecca asked if I would be willing to attend a small meeting, nothing formal, nothing that would draw attention, just a conversation with the people who had been reviewing the situation, and I agreed without hesitation, not because I was eager for confrontation, but because I understood that there comes a point when observation must become presence. And that morning a black sedan pulled up outside the motel, quiet and unremarkable in a way that felt intentional, and I stepped inside without asking where we were going, because I already knew this was not about location, it was about timing, and the drive took less than 30 minutes, ending at a modest office building that did not try to impress anyone from the outside. But once inside, everything was precise, organized, deliberate, and I was led into a conference room where 3 people were already seated, their expressions calm, their posture attentive. And Rebecca introduced them briefly, a legal advisor, a financial analyst, and a representative connected to the insurance review. And I took my seat at the end of the table, placing my hands gently in front of me, not claiming space, but not shrinking from it either, and they began to speak, not all at once, not overlapping, each one adding a piece to something that had already started forming in my mind, explaining that the policy changes, the access requests, and the timeline of activity surrounding the property all pointed to coordination rather than coincidence. And I listened without interrupting, my gaze steady, my breathing even, because reacting too early would only cloud what needed to remain clear. And then one of them placed a document in front of me, sliding it across the table with care, and I looked down at it, recognizing the signature immediately, not because I had written it, but because I knew the subtle differences that only come from years of signing your own name. And this was not mine. It was an imitation, careful, practiced, but not exact, and I did not say anything, not yet, because the moment did not require words, it required understanding, and as they continued, outlining next steps, potential actions, and the importance of allowing certain processes to unfold without interference, I realized that what had been taken from me had not been taken in silence. It had left a trail, and that trail was now being followed with a level of precision that matched whatever had been planned against me. And when the discussion came to a close, Rebecca looked at me, not asking for permission, but acknowledging that the next move would belong to me, and I nodded once, because there was no longer any doubt about what needed to happen, not in terms of reaction, but in terms of position. And as I stood up from that chair, I did not feel like someone who had been displaced. I felt like someone who had stepped into a place that had always been hers, one that did not depend on land or approval or acceptance. And as we walked out of that room, I understood something with complete clarity. The people who thought they had removed me from the story had only moved me to a different part of it, one where I was no longer being overlooked, but finally being seen for exactly who I had always been. The meeting ended without raised voices, without accusations spoken aloud, but the weight of what had been uncovered stayed with me as clearly as if it had been written in bold across the walls. And later that afternoon, Rebecca asked if I would like to return to the property one more time, not alone, not uncertain, but with everything in place, and I agreed, because there are moments when you do not go back to what was lost. You go back to stand in what remains, and when we arrived, the same Land stretched out before me, quiet, open, but no longer undefined. And this time there were no strangers walking it without explanation, no unanswered questions hanging in the air, only a stillness that felt different from before, as if something had shifted beneath the surface, and I stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the space not as someone who had been removed from it, but as someone who understood it more clearly than anyone standing there. And it did not take long before another car pulled up, familiar in a way that made everything settle into place, and Daniel stepped out first, followed by Ashley, both of them stopping a few feet away as if unsure how close they were allowed to come. And for a moment none of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed, and I looked at them calmly, not searching for apology, not waiting for explanation, because those things come when they are real, not when they are expected. And Daniel finally spoke, his voice less certain than I had ever heard it, asking what was going on, why there were people involved, why things had changed so quickly, and I listened without interrupting, letting his questions fill the space between us. And when he finished, I did not raise my voice, did not step closer. I simply answered in a tone as steady as the ground beneath my feet, explaining that the situation was being reviewed properly now, that everything connected to the property, to the documents, to the decisions that had been made without me, was being examined carefully, and that from this point forward, nothing would move without clarity. And Ashley shifted slightly beside him, her expression tightening in a way that revealed more than any words could, and I saw then what I needed to see, not guilt in the dramatic sense, but awareness, the kind that comes when a plan begins to unravel. And I did not press further, because there was no need to force anything into the open that was already making its way there. And after a moment, I added one more thing, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. I told them that I would not be stepping aside anymore, that whatever had been assumed about my place, my voice, my presence, had been incorrect, and that going forward, I would be part of every decision that concerned what was mine. And I watched as that settled over them, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And then I turned and walked back toward the car, not because I had finished something, but because I had begun it. And as I sat down and the door closed beside me, I understood with quiet certainty that this was not about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about redefining what could no longer be taken at all.